All right, weekly Tanya text-based class. We are in chapter 30. Very good. We started chapter 30 last week. We're speaking about humility, about being humble before every person. Our sages enjoin us. Be humble before everyone. And the Alter Rebbe asks, is this just like a figure of speech? Act as if you were humbled by everyone, but really in truth you know you're better than them, but you're not gonna act that way. You're gonna act humble. Or does it literally mean to be humbled before everyone, to look at everyone, even people who at first glance are not doing very well spiritually, and to say, wow, that guy is really, he puts me to shame. Wow. What do you mean? He puts himself to shame. He's not behaving the way he's supposed to behave, and you're supposed to feel humble before him? So the Alter Rebbe says, yes. You know why? I'm just reviewing what we said last week. Because it's not about the performance, it's about the effort. So somebody could be performing on a high level, or even a perfect level. He's a Beinoni. And another person is performing on an abysmal level. What he's actually putting out is he's failing 99% of the time. But the effort that it took him to fail 99% of the time is greater than the effort that it takes you to succeed 100% of the time. That's how he explained it. So you could be humbled before this guy and say, wow, that guy has a much more intense struggle than I have. Even though the output, if you compare the output, you're doing great. He's doing really poorly. But that's not what we're comparing. We're comparing how much the internal struggle is, how much we're engaged in the internal struggle. Okay. So last week, the end of the class, the Alter Rebbe made a little pivot, a little logical pivot, and he said, what's the difference between positive commandments and negative commandments? Ultimately, they're all Hashem's will. Whether you do what Hashem wants you to do or you refrain from doing what Hashem doesn't want you to do, ultimately it's all the same. It's about Hashem's will. And the reason the Alter Rebbe says that is because he might say, well, hold on a second. This guy who I'm trying to feel humble before, he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, and he's doing what he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, he's doing what he's not supposed to be doing, right? Okay. And me, I admit that I may have areas where I could put forth more effort, but they're all in areas of doing more good. In other words, I'm not sinning. This is the person, the theoretical person that Tanya is speaking to. This is a guy who already is a Beinoni. I'm not sinning. I don't do anything I'm not supposed to do. Sure, I could do the good things on a better level, but how can you compare it to a guy who's doing stuff he's not supposed to be doing? So the Alter Rebbe says, what's the difference? It's all about how surrendered you are to Hashem's will. So does it matter if it's expressed as adhering to a positive commandment or refraining from violating a negative commandment? Bottom line is, how much effort are you willing to put in for Hashem? And so he starts using examples, like he says, Tefillah bechavana. That was the last thing we spoke about. Tefillah bechavana. Davening with intent. When you daven, and even you daven with intent, but you daven with intent to the point where he calls it mitzvah nefesh. I remember we covered that. Ad mitzvah nefesh. Maybe even I'll just start from that line. Do you daven to the point of the wringing out of the soul? Do you fight with your animal soul, which is blocking your ability to have intent? With an intense war. And do you engage in this war 3 times a day? וגם בשעס התפילה ליגע עצמי ביגיעס נפש ויגיעס basar כמשיש בו לכמה בריחס. And do you toil your flesh and your soul? Like we explain later what that means. Those are two different things. The toil of the flesh and the toil of the soul. We'll explain it later, so I won't get into it here. Here's the point the Alter Rebbe is making. Anyone who's not at the level of that intense struggle, to fight an intense war, you haven't come to the level of the intensity of struggle of the guy who has the fiery furnace Yetzer Hara. You haven't come to that level of being totally subjugated to Hashem out of great awe of Hashem. So, just to refresh why we're speaking this way. In chapter 29, the previous chapter, we were speaking about somebody who was suffering from complacency. And we read him the riot act. I should use the right pronouns here. I read, according to the Alter Rebbe's guidance, I read myself the riot act. Nobody did it to me, and I didn't do it to anybody else. To break the apathy. A similar thing's happening here, which is we're trying to break the apathy. So in case I thought I could coast, let's say I'm actually a Beinoni already, okay? And I don't know how many times around learning Tanya it takes before you actually become a Beinoni. You know, each time you're a little bit closer. But let's say even theoretically you got to the point where it's your fourth, fifth time through Tanya and you're a Beinoni already. I'm just, that's my humor. I'm just... Many of us have learned Tanya many more times than 4 or 5 times, and we haven't yet completely achieved behavioral perfection, but we're getting there. We're getting there. We're getting there, okay? And in general, we like to be very supportive. In general, the vibe here is every little bit should be celebrated, but in this immediate context, we're not being all supportive and positive. Because we're addressing an issue. We're addressing the issue of complacency. So a person falls into a rut of complacency. We spoke about in the previous chapter how we smashed that through forcing him to confront the reality of his situation. I wanted to look something up. Could somebody Google something for me? Bashgacha Pratis, I saw something, I don't even know why it popped up in a Google search. It's a quote from Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright. A quote from Chekhov. And he says something about man will not improve or he will not be better. Someone get that quote for me. I just saw it yesterday. I was like, wow, that's good. A man will not become better than he is. Okay.
Better when you show him what he's like.
Say it again.
Man will become better when you show him what he is like.
Man will become better when you show him what he is like. Okay, so I don't know why Google thought, I certainly wasn't Googling for Chekhov quotes the other day. But somehow this came up. And man will become better when you show him who he is, how he is, what he is, what he's like. And I'm sure it's a translation from Russian anyway, so. And I thought, wow, that's chapter 29. You force yourself to come face to face with your actual spiritual situation, and then it causes you to become better. We're continuing that same approach here in chapter 30, and we're saying, in case you are slipping into apathy and you are resting on your laurels, let's stop a second and look at people who, at first glance, we deem to be spiritual failures. these are, objectively speaking, immoral people, or they behave very immorally. And it's very easy to dismiss them and say, well, there but for the grace of God go I. At least I'm not that guy. And what we're saying is, well, in the context of trying to smash our apathy, it's probably going to be more productive to say, wow, I really admire that guy. What, that scumbag, you admire him? Well, not his behaviors, no, no. But I'm humbled by the challenge, the intensity of his struggle. You know how much struggle that guy goes through to not be an even bigger jerk than he is? And me, am I struggling? I'm a naturally good guy. We all like to think of ourselves as naturally good, right? How much struggle does it really take you to be a good person? You're a naturally good person. Yeah, that's right, I am. Yeah, okay. So then, how would you like to start to examine this area of your life as far as the intensity of your struggle? All right, now he's going to continue, and he's going to give us examples of areas where we might struggle more. Even though we're not doing anything wrong, we're perfect. In theory, we're talking to somebody who's already perfect. And if you're not even behaviorally perfect, then it's only with a kal v'chomer how much more so this logic applies. But even somebody who's achieved behavioral perfection, the Beinoni of the Tanya. Yeah.
So his examples right now that he's going to give is to generate a sense of humility within ourselves?
No. Okay, you ask, are the examples supposed to generate a sense of humility within us? No, we've done that. We've mustered up the humility feeling. Now he's going to give us examples of applications where you might direct that humility. In other words, would you like some suggestions where you might struggle more? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. V'chein be'inyan birkas hamazing. Not just davening 3 times a day, but what about the grace after meals? V'kol birkas hanenin. And all blessings that you make on food or other things that you enjoy. V'hamitzvahs bechavona. And any mitzvahs you do you have intent? In other words, when you bench, I know you bench, you're a religious Jew, you always bench after you eat bread, but do you think about the words? Do you connect emotionally to what you're saying? And all brachas, when you make a shahakal on water, is it perfunctory? Or do you force yourself to have kavanah? And when you do any mitzvah, do you do it with kavanah? Ve'ein tzarich leimer kavanas hamitzvahs lishman. And it goes without saying that one of the things you should be monitoring yourself regarding is when you do a mitzvah, any mitzvah, whatever it is, do you have in mind that you're doing it for the sake of the mitzvah itself? Meaning not for any reward that you may accrue, but for the inherent value of the mitzvah. Oh, okay. So these are areas where we might find that we could be struggling a little bit more. V'chein be'inyan asik limud Torah. Also learning Torah. I'm sure you're learning Torah already, but what about lilmeid harbe yesim mechaftzeritzayne lefi tevei regilusay aydei melchamatzuma im gufay? What about learning much more than your desire and your will, according to your nature and your habituation, and to do that, to overcome that through waging an intense battle with your body? In other words, yeah, you're learning, but you're used to it. Yeah.
Also, it's saying much more than your nature, so it's like now you're going to change your nature.
Well, he gives you 2 examples. He says, Tivai uregilusai, your nature and your habituation. So you already did change your nature, sort of by default. Over time, you can become accustomed to good things, even if it was beyond your nature. And he's saying, can you push yourself past both of those? Not only past your nature, because maybe you did already, just by default over the years, you got used to things that you you weren't naturally predisposed to, but now you are. It became second nature. That's called regilus. But could you push yourself past that? So a guy doesn't have any problem. It's not a milchama tzuma for him to learn for an hour. But if he would learn for 2 hours, that would take him a milchama tzuma. Now you're going to say, well, hold on a second. You're comparing me to a guy that for him to open up a sefer and not even learn from it once a year is a milchama tzuma. And I learn an hour a day. How could you compare me and him? Well, we're not comparing how much time you spend learning. We know you learn much more than that guy. We're comparing how much you struggle with it. This guy has PTSD from yeshiva, and to open a sefer, to walk into a beis medrash where there are svarim on the wall is a milchama tzuma. Okay, so tell me when you break a sweat. Tell me when it becomes as intense for you as it is for him. That's all we're saying. Okay. Ki halaymin ma'at yesimetive harezu milchama kitana. If you only learn a little bit more than your habit, your nature, that's a small war. That would not yet equate the intensity of the struggle of this guy with the roaring, raging Yetzer Hara. This guy, when he fails, is called a Rasha Gomer. Look at the stakes that he's up against. This guy is battling, his battle line is the line between doing a mitzvah and doing an aveda. Now that's not your battle line. You're all mitzvahs. But in order to have the same degree of battle that this guy's having when he's fighting himself not to do an aveda, and even if in the end he does the aveda, but the struggle that he put into it trying not to do the aveda, for you to have that same level of struggle in your learning, he gives the example of learning right now, it wouldn't be enough to learn a little bit more than your habit and your nature. You'd have to learn a lot more in order to have that level of intense struggle. And again he says, Umali bechinas sumira, umali bechinas vasei toiv. What difference does it make if it's go away from evil or do good? Those are expressions David HaMelech uses in Tehillim. Sumira v'asei toiv. Go away from evil and do good. He says, what difference does it make if this guy's struggle is in refraining from sinning and your struggle is in doing more good? Hakel hi mitzvahs hamelech hakodesh yachad miyuchad baruch hu. Either way, they're all commandments of the King, the singular and unique King. Blessed be He.
So Tanya is calling a Rasha Gomer? Did I miss that?
This guy we're comparing ourselves
The
to.
apathetic guy is
No,
Oh,
the guy you're comparing yourself to.
oh, he's okay.
He,
Makes more sense.
when he fails, he's a Rasha Gomer,
Oh, got it. You're not,
right?
because you're fine.
Right. But
Got it.
you have to understand, when he fails, what's at stake? He becomes a Rasha Gomer. Okay, so that's a real struggle. Now, when you fail like a very soft failure. Oh, so you benched, but you didn't think about all the words. So you're not a Rasha Gomer. But what he's doing is he's saying, you know what? I need you to feel a little bit more intensity here. Like if you knew the battle line was between abject moral failure and doing the right thing, then it becomes more dramatic, more pronounced, then all of a sudden you wake up. And that's where that guy who we're looking at right now, that's where his battle line is. Your battle line is, in the worst case scenario, okay, so you bench really fast and you don't think about all the words. But he's saying, you know what, you need to look at that as, qualitatively speaking, as big of a failure as when that guy fails and becomes a Rasha Gomer.
So do we always have to have a big struggle with that intensity? Because you're going to get to this point where now you are thinking about what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Fine, but then now you're not struggling anymore because you got to that point. So we always have to have an intense struggle like Russia, even when we achieve, say, the higher.
Right. I mean,
Omega.
your question really answers itself. I mean, you're asking, do we always have to have that intensity? What about in periods of growth where we actually we achieve it, right? So you're answering the question. Obviously, these things ebb and flow. You know, you reminded me of an interesting story.
How do they even know that they're struggling? They don't care. How would
They do
struggle?
care. We know that the Rishoyim are Malayim Charotes. We learn about in chapter 10 and chapter 11 when we introduce the Rasha. We say that they're full of guilt. So, yeah, they are struggling. They're failing,
Okay.
but they're struggling. But you're saying about when that which used to be a struggle becomes natural or second nature. You remind me of a story I heard from Tuvia Teldin about a guy he knew in Montreal who came from a secular Jewish family. The father, so Reb Tuvia knew this Bacher, and the Bacher his father was a pharmacist. He was not religious. Traditional, not religious. But the son became a Lubavitcher Bacher, and he was full on, completely religious, completely Hasidic. And so the father, who was a pharmacist, and he wanted his son to drop out of yeshiva and to go to pharmacy school to take over the pharmacy. That was like his big dream. So the father had yechidus with the Rebbe to basically complain to the Rebbe that his son is becoming a bum. Like, yeah, he's on the derech. And he was upset about it, yeah. So it's very interesting what the Rebbe told him. The Rebbe told the father, and I don't know if the Rebbe told the father anything about his son, but the upshot of the Yechidus, what the Rebbe told the father, was about the father's own Yiddishkeit. He told the father that you should do every mitzvah that you're comfortable with and one mitzvah that you're uncomfortable with. And that's it. That's all you should do. Whatever mitzvahs you're comfortable with, obviously, why wouldn't you do them? You're comfortable with them, so do them. And then pick one mitzvah that you're uncomfortable with, and just do that. One mitzvah you're uncomfortable with. It's brilliant. So what happened? What do you suppose happened?
He became religious.
Because the mitzvah that was uncomfortable eventually became comfortable. So then it went into the category of mitzvahs I'm comfortable with. So he had to pick a new uncomfortable mitzvah. And then he would do that for a while until he was comfortable with it. And that went into the category of the comfortable mitzvahs.
And the eighth was also very compassionate.
Of course, but the compassion and the ingenuity of it go hand in hand. It's just such profound insight into the human psyche. Basically, you have to have a degree of struggle. How much struggle? Okay, that's a question for a spiritual guide to figure out what's appropriate for each person. But the point is, the tension of that struggle ultimately resolves itself, and then you have to renew it by creating new tension. So to answer your question, yeah, obviously this thing is going to ebb and flow. It's not perfectly linear. There are going to be times where that which was uncomfortable becomes comfortable, and then we're going to have to reassess. Yeah. Okay. So he was saying, what difference does it make if it's a positive or a negative commandment? What does it matter if it's sumera or asay tov? V'chein b'shar mitzvahs befrat b'davar sheb'mamei. And this applies to all mitzvahs, but especially to monetary mitzvahs. Now he's getting personal. Telling me to bench with more kavanah, that's one thing. Now he's touching my pocketbook. Kemei Avedis HaTzedakah Kagavna, like the Aveda, he calls it Avedis HaTzedakah, not just the mitzvah of tzedakah, but Avedis HaTzedakah, the work of giving tzedakah and the like. How much are you pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone? I recorded a podcast yesterday with a friend of mine. So a friend of mine, Ellie Nash, he lives in Florida now. He grew up in Crown Heights. I'll tell you how I started the podcast. I said to him, you have spoken vocally all over the world about two issues that most people are terrified to speak about, to acknowledge they exist, let alone to personally identify with. He spoke about surviving childhood sexual abuse, and he spoke about addiction to pornography. And that you have no problem with. I said, but the one issue that you always get scared to mention anytime I ask you about it is money. Like, you're very coy about money. So I said, could we try to break through that? And he's like, yes, I'm definitely, I'm up for that type of experience. Let's try to break through whatever the hesitations are about talking about money. So I said, listen, you gave away $1 million of tzedakah before you turned 25. That's a known thing. It was a public thing. He made a goal. He's going to give away $1 million before he turns 25. And he did it. Okay. How much did he make? I don't know, but you do the math, right? So I was like, talk to me about money. Like, what could you tell us as somebody who gave away $1 million before you're 25? Like, what can you tell us about money? So he said a lot of good stuff. But one thing he said that really, I don't know, I just found it resonated with me. He said, when you're giving, try to add a zero. I said, a zero? That means 10 times as much? You're saying give 10 times as much? So he said, no, I don't mean your total giving. I mean the size of one-time gifts that you're comfortable giving. So if you're normally comfortable, if your comfort zone ends at, let's say, I could give $1,000 gift. So try to at least once try to give a $10,000 gift. And if you're comfortable with giving a $10,000 gift, then at least once push yourself to do a $100,000 gift. And I asked him, where's your comfort zone right now? He told me 7 figures is I'm not comfortable. Like, he said, I worked my way up and I could do a 6-figure gift, but 7 I'm still afraid of. But that's on the that's on the aspirational list. At any rate, it's meaning he never gave $1 million in one shot. He's given millions of dollars over the years, but he never gave $1 million in one shot. So that's like the next breakthrough, is to give $1 million gift in one shot. At any rate, I don't know if he was basing it on chapter 30 of Tanya or not, but this is what it's saying right here, that there has to be a struggle, and it has to be a struggle that's equal to the intensity of struggle of this guy who has this raging Yetzer Hara. There has to be a struggle when you're giving tzedakah. So to give and to give generously is one thing. And maybe that's the mitzvah. Maybe that's what he's saying, Avedis HaTzedakah as opposed to mitzvahs HaTzedakah. Mitzvahs HaTzedakah, you give Maisa, you're good. But then there's an Aveda, there's a work of actually creating tension through your giving. So I don't know if, like Ellie said, add a zero. I'm not, that was just his thing. And apparently it worked for him because he got himself up to, it worked for him. But I'm not saying that's the number, although it makes a lot of sense. But what the Alter Rebbe is describing is to ask yourself, when you give tzedakah, is it as painful and difficult for you as it is when this moral failure is struggling not to do another egregious sin? Just a question to ask ourselves. Okay. Let's continue here. Now, until this point, we were saying you could do better in the good stuff, and we weren't digging into doing less of the bad stuff, because we were just saying, no, you're probably not doing anything bad, but you could do more of the good. But now he says, as long as we're digging, even in areas of going away from evil. Every intelligent person, you have to be intelligent, but every intelligent person will be able to find that he's not completely, entirely, he's not entirely, completely, wholly going away from evil. Is your effort in getting away from evil stuff as intense as the effort of the Milchama Atzuma that this other guy is putting forth? In other words, we're not accusing you of sinning. We know you're not sinning. But when you're avoiding sin, is your degree of effort in distancing yourself from even the possibility of sin as intense as the struggle of this guy who ends up sinning? We could all, I think we could all relate to the idea of being comfortable to a certain point that we think is safe. You know, like when you go to the subway and there's that yellow line, and you don't stand beyond the yellow line because then you're too close to the subway car. But do you have to go right up to the line? You know, would it hurt to? If you go to the subway with your kids, you don't let them go up to the line. You say, kids, sit back on the bench, stand by the wall. So all of us could also ask, even in Sumera, even a Beinani could ask himself in Sumera, yeah, I know I'm not doing actual Avedas, but to what extent do I wage a battle to distance myself even further, even from the possibility of temptation?
Does the ultimate Rebbe expect us to either measure the other person's struggle or try to put yourself
in his position and imagine it? Because remember, this isn't really, your judgment of the person isn't really relevant. Like, you're not going to do anything with this judgment. It's not really even about that other guy. It's a barometer for ourselves. So it's a theoretical judgment. It's an imaginary judgment. It's not even, I don't even want to use the word judgment because judgment sounds like we're being judgmental, and it's the exact opposite. It's like an assessment. An assessment. It's a, I think you said put yourself in their shoes, right? Right. So imagine you were this guy. And yeah, if you were this guy, you'd be a lot less frum, but maybe you'd be a lot more engaged in your moral struggle. In other words, there are two scenarios. There's a guy who's not doing good stuff, but his struggle to be as bad as he is and not even worse is an intense struggle. And then there's another person, which ostensibly the person reading Tanya identifies with this category, of a person who's generally doing good stuff, but it's autopilot.
It's basically saying that if we use that struggle, then we would be on a much higher level than we currently are. We could be on a much higher level. But because we feel like we're in the green, then we don't feel...
I would say even more than that. not only if we struggled to that degree, we could be on a higher level, but struggling to that degree is the higher level. In other words, it's not just about the behaviors that the struggle would produce. It's the inherent value of that struggle.
Right. So does that mean that we're judged differently?
I don't know. It's really not about judgment here.
But we know that there's a concept of olam haba, there's a concept of...
Yeah, but that's not really the point here. Remember the point that we started in chapter 26. Chapter 26, we were troubleshooting various sources of emotional dysfunction. So things that make us sad, things that make us feel shame and guilt that distract us from serving Hashem properly. Now we're dealing with the emotional problem called apathy. So the whole point here is really to overcome the apathy. That's the real, don't lose sight of the reason why we're having this discussion in the first place.
This
Right.
is
If
avodas
I had this
havido.
question where, like, if to face my guilt, that, like, if I'm struggling more in an area, am I going to be judged the same as a person who's not struggling?
Yeah, but I don't think that's the way we should look at it. Like, it's not about how we're being judged. This is
Helping with caricature traits. Is that?
this is not about judgment. I mean,
Right, this
About becoming better people?
it's about becoming alive. It's very easy to fall into a pattern where we're doing good things and we're doing enough of the good things that the passion dwindles. And we're trying to get back that passion. We're trying to get back that feeling. So, look, we don't normally speak this way. We normally like to be very positive and encouraging. But in this immediate context where apathy has become an acute issue, so this is one of the ways that we deal with it, is it's a little bit of a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call, yeah.
But is it also because if a person is apathetic in a relationship, the relationship is not a meaningful one. If you just go through the motions, it's not a meaningful relationship.
Right. So that's what he says. And remember, in chapter 29, the previous chapter, how does he describe one of the chief symptoms of apathy is that when he's davening, he's not feeling anything. Okay? Meaning, like you're calling it, you're in a relationship, but you're not having that emotional connection. So he's in a relationship with Hashem, and he's even doing what Hashem wants him to do, and the passion is gone. And that's not a luxury. It's not a triviality. Having that passion is part and parcel of our relationship with Hashem. It's essential. It's essential to the relationship. So we're trying to recapture it in a case where it's where that has become a problem. And this is one of the ways as we give ourselves this somewhat harsh wake-up call. Okay, let's continue here. He gives another example of intense struggles that even a overall really good guy might be able to find an opportunity to exercise in day-to-day life. Kagoin, for example, lahafsik be'emtza sicha no oy siper begnus chaveroi. To stop in the middle of a pleasant conversation or a story that doesn't reflect well on someone else. Now you're going to say, well, hold on, that's an Aveda, that's Lashon Hara. No, we're not even talking about full-fledged Lashon Hara. Then that would be obvious. Va'afilo gnai kotten v'kalma oid. Even something that is a very minor disparagement. Afshahu emes, even though it's true. Va'afilo kedei lenakes atzmei, even if the reason is to exonerate oneself. Kenede Mahad Amr, Rabbi Shimon La'aviv Rabbeinu HaKadosh, as is known from that which Rabbi Shimon said to his father, Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Lav ano kosve, I didn't write it. There was a document in Bezdin, in the rabbinical court, that had some sloppiness to it. And Rabbi Yehuda Anasi was asking, hey, what's up with this document? It's got problems. And so his son, Rabbi Shimon, said, I didn't write it. Elo Yehuda Chaita Kosve. Yehuda Chaita, Judah the tailor, who was one of the other sages, he wrote it. Like, don't ask me. I didn't write it. Ask Yehuda the tailor. He wrote it. Va'amarle, and Rabbi said to his son, Kalech maloshen hara. Desist from your lashon hara. He didn't mean actual lashon hara. He meant on your level. Ein sham begemara reish perik yud de Bava Basra. Go look in the beginning of chapter 10 of Bava Basra. Ukahai gavne kama mile deshchiche tuva. And there are many examples that are similar to this that you could go and figure out. Things that are really not technically prohibited, but if you were vigilant and you were waging that intense battle, then you would be able to find the motivation to be scrupulous even about those things that are beyond the letter of the law. Ubefrat be'inyin lakadish atzmei b'mutalai. Oh, now he's upping the ante. And especially in areas where you could sanctify yourself regarding your relationship with permissible things. So now we're talking about things that are entirely permissible. There's no prohibition or even nearing or approaching the risk of transgressing a prohibition. It's all about totally permissible stuff. Shehuma deraisa, but he says that's actually a biblical obligation. Kaddish atzmecha b'mutalach is a biblical obligation. Kemei shekosov kadeshim tiyu v'geimer. Yiskadishtem v'geimer. Like it says, you should be holy. Make yourselves holy. So what does that mean? That means, do you have milchama tzuma when it comes to, do I really need to have a second scoop of ice cream? I had one scoop of ice cream. I really need a second. Is this Avodas Hashem? Am I glorifying God by having a second scoop of ice cream? No, but I really want it, and it would be intensely, it would be intensely troublesome to force myself not to have the second scoop of ice cream. And we say, well, yeah, great. So there's a guy who's a moral failure, and he's intensely struggling. Okay, so he's struggling with serious sins. And you're struggling with the second scoop of ice cream. But what does it matter what the struggle is? The question is, how much struggle is there? Like, yeah, okay. V'gam divrei sofrim chamurim medivrei Torah v'chulu. And by the way, rabbinical stuff is more chomer, it's more egregious, even than biblical stuff. We know that the palace guards shoot first. The king can pardon you. If you bum rush the palace, if you manage to make it to the throne room, this is the mashal that Chazal give, that if you manage to get to the throne room, the king can decide, don't bother him, let him go, I don't know. He's some wacko, just let him go. But the palace guards don't have that discretion. The palace guards have to shoot. Ubefrat be'inyin l'kadish hatzmei, we said that, v'gam divrei sofrim, okay. Ala shekol elo v'chayetz behen hein, ma'avenes sha'adam dosh ba'kovav. These are all things that people trounce upon underfoot. V'gam naisu keheter machmas sha'avar v'shanu v'chulu. And they become as if they were permissible through just doing them over and over, becoming used to them. There's a saying from our sages that if a person sins twice, it only takes twice, it becomes as if it's excusable. you lose the sensitivity, and it's like, okay, I don't know, is it really such a problem? I don't know, I do it all the time. So he's saying there's a lot of stuff. They're not actual Avedas, but they are things that you could do better. And because we're so used to not doing them in the better way, it just becomes very easy for us to behave callously. V'gam naisu keheter yasadet aval be'emes im hu yedei sefer machzik b'teiras Hashem v'kivas Elokim yechpatz. If this is a person who knows, he's a Yedei Sefer, he knows how to learn a little bit. Not saying a Talmud Chacham, he's not a scholar, but a guy who knows how to learn. Someone comes to a weekly Tanya shir, maybe, and somebody who holds on to the Torah of Hashem and who desires closeness to God. So we're talking about a person who is in the game, someone who does value spiritual growth and doing mitzvahs and learning Torah. So if that's who you are, then Gadol Aveinei Minasei, then your sin is too great to bear, subjectively speaking. Vashmasei Gadla B'chiflei Chiflayim, your sin is doubly great, double and redoubled great. B'ma she'einen nilcham u'mizbarer al yitzrei, mizgaber al yitzrei, why don't you fight such an intense battle like the battle that we've described that the other guy fights? The wanton sinners, those people who sit out on the corner all day and who are very far from the service of Hashem and His Torah. In other words, we're flipping the whole argument. You're saying, that guy, he hangs out on the corners all day. He's a total bum. He doesn't care. You never see him in shul. He never goes to a beis medrash. He's hanging out on the corner, hanging out in the pool hall with the riffraff. That guy's a bum, and I'm a good Jew. And we say, yeah, exactly. That's an argument to the reverse of what you're trying to say. Because this guy is... whatever, he calls him Kal Shabakalim. I'll use that term, Kal Shabakalim. So, what do you expect from him? But you do care about this stuff. You do value spiritual growth. You do value Torah and mitzvahs. So, I would think, based on what you yourself care about, you would be struggling a little bit more. So he flips the whole thing on us. And remember, I'll just say again the disclaimer. This is not the typical way that we speak to ourselves, but when we need to do this to nudge ourselves out of our complacency, then yes, we do speak to ourselves this way. Yeah. Ve'ein ashmasim g'dela kol kach. Those sinners, their guilt is not so great. When they don't conquer their inclination, which is burning like a furnace. That they don't overcome their Yetzer Hara because, meaning if they were to overcome it, would be because of fear of God who sees and understands all. And they're not able to do that. And we're not saying what they're doing is okay. We're not excusing it. We're just saying we're explaining it. We're not excusing it. We're explaining it. We're saying they're doing wrong, but there's like the objective black and white binary categories. Is it right or is it wrong? Okay, it's wrong. But then there's the nuanced, qualitative, subjective assessment. Yeah, how wrong? It's sort of like there's the verdict and there's the sentencing. The verdict is the guy's guilty, he did it. But when it comes to sentencing, Your Honor, look at this guy's situation, look at his background, look at, and he didn't even know what he was doing, and somebody talked him into it, and, okay, whatever. And you give the whole mitigating circumstances. And so even though the guy is guilty, we're not saying he's not guilty. He's not saying he's not guilty, but we can go light on him in the sentencing. And again, the point of this is not teaching us to be tolerant and non-judgmental. I just want to repeat that. The point of this chapter is not about refraining from judging others. It's not the point here. It may emerge from this chapter that that's also a good thing, and it is a good thing, but that's not the point here. The point here is motivating ourselves. And you can motivate yourself by saying, a guy who's failing, but his overall situation is sort of nabach. It's not a thriving spiritual situation. But me, who I do care about this stuff, and I have endeavored to put myself into more positive situations, I got to ask myself, how hard do I work? How hard do I fight? Okay. So this guy, this Kal Shabakalim, his sin, his guilt for his sin is not as intense. Ka'ashmas kol hakorev el Hashem ve'el teras va'avedase. It's not as bad as the guilt of somebody who's close to Hashem and his Torah and his service. Ukamesha Amr Razal Gabe Acher. Like the sages said about the sage who later was known as Acher. His real name was Elisha, but then he became known as Acher, as an other. Yeah, Elisha ben Avuya. And he came back from out-of-body experience, and he basically renounced his faith. So it says about him, Shiyada bichvedi v'chulu. His sin is all the more egregious because he knew my glory, Hashem says. So we're not calling you an acher, but what we are saying is, you know better. You know better. V'lachin amr razal al amei ha'aretz shizdeines nais lahem kishgages. That's why the sages say, when it comes to the amei ha'aretz, the ignorant, unlettered masses, that even their wanton sins are reckoned as unintentional sins. It goes down a notch. Because what do they really understand? Do they really grasp the gravity of what a sin is? So it's as if it were unintentional. It's as if it were inadvertent. Because they don't, even when they know what they're doing, they don't know what they're doing. However, the way we need to look at ourselves is, we know what we're doing. We know better. And even if we're doing everything right, how much struggle goes into that, okay? So, just again, to remind you, this is not a way that I want you to look at yourself on a day-to-day basis. I don't want you to wake up every morning and say, I'm so wretched, I'm not struggling, I don't sweat when I say Birkas Hamazon, I'm worse than the biggest scumbag on earth. I don't want you to do that on a daily basis. But when you feel what would be a reason that you would do this? When you're sensing apathy, when you're sensing a lack of zest, where the passion has dwindled, you may need to muster up some new motivation through this method. Although, as I told you in chapter 29, there are other methods as well, which may be even more effective in our particular generation. But this is a method, at least it's good for us to know about it.